Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Eliana Kernodle. A forthcoming Supreme Court case will determine the legality of the religious charter schools that operate with public taxpayer dollars. Joining me to dig into this is Chalkboard News editor Brennan Clary. Brennan, what case did the Supreme Court agree to take up?
Yeah, so it decided to hear the case of St. Isidore of Seville Catholic Virtual Schools application to operate as a religious charter school. I'm not sure about the specific name of the case, but that's essentially who is asking for the Supreme Court to hear the case. And for those who maybe are hearing about this for the first time, St. Isidore asked to be a religious charter school, so like a publicly funded religious charter school in Oklahoma. And so the Oklahoma Supreme Court previously struck that down about 7 months ago. And so this is a big development for St. Isidore to try to keep that case going. And a lot of speculation has resulted from this announcement from the Supreme Court about, what the highest court in the land will determine about the legality of a religious charter school. So that was kind of the big first from St. Isidore, was that it was essentially the first application of a religious charter school to be publicly funded. And so, as you can imagine, that has riled a lot of people who are very concerned about the separation of, church and state. Like, they bring that up a lot. And so that is one of the big questions that this is dealing with, right? And so that's kind of the longstanding history there. And I want to point out too that there are, I think, critics of this on both sides of the aisle who are saying, like, we should not have public taxpayer funds going toward religious schools. So that's an interesting sort of conundrum there. But that is essentially the case that's going forward toward the Supreme Court right now.
And what are some of the specifics of questions that people expect them to address when they're hearing this case?
Yeah, Michael Petrilli, who's president of the Thomas Fordham Institute, he wrote a really great piece. And so Austin Gergens, our reporter for Chalkboard News, he pulled some of that information from his commentary piece that he wrote recently. And essentially, the question that Petrilli points out is whether the law will view charter schools, or whether SCOTUS will say that the law views charter schools as essentially government contractors rather than parts of the government itself. So that kind of brings up a great question of, is a charter school a government entity, or is it somebody who is contracted with the government? And so that kind of raises questions like, if you have a public school district that's traditional and it's elected and, it's funded with state money and taxpayer money, then that is an extension of the government. And I think that there's some precedent in law to determine that. But then it's like, well, is a charter school the same thing, or is it legally different? And Petrilli also speculated that denying charter schools to otherwise qualified nonprofits merely because of their religious nature amounts to anti-religious discrimination and thus violates the First Amendment's free exercise clause. So that's the question of, can you discriminate against a religious charter school simply because it's religious? And so that's sort of the other question. And the St. Isidore's proponents say, no, you can't, because the Supreme Court has ruled that you can't discriminate against somebody just because just because of deeply held religious beliefs, or because something is religious in nature, and that would actually be a violation of your First Amendment rights. Like, you're having a discrimination against you because you have these deeply held religious beliefs. So they're saying you can't do that. You can't withhold public funds from an otherwise qualified contractor just because it's religious in nature. So that's sort of the tension that you have, is like, well, what is the separation of church and state? And then what can you deny somebody because of the religious aspect of an organization, right? And so that is kind of these core questions about religious charter schools. Can they, these sort of separate parts of them exist together under the law, under the Constitution? So it's really kind of an exciting thing for people who get really into it. And I think that there's a lot of questions that need to be resolved here, as we've seen through Oklahoma and the different developments in the case up till now.
What are some possible consequences of this decision?
Yeah, Petrilli had great prognostications, if you will. He said that we could see, if the Supreme Court approves this and says that this is a good thing and this is allowable, then you probably, quote, see thousands of Catholic and other religious schools turn into charter schools in every corner of the country in the next year or two. Although he said, there's some caveats to that. Some states have made it harder than others to make religious schools into charter schools, to convert them. And he also said that, those who live in red states, where there's maybe already a lot of education choice, a lot of different kinds of laws on the books, to promote school choice for families, like they'd probably embrace that or make peace with that. That was something that Petrilli said. And then he also said that there could be an opposite effect where, quote, it would be easy to imagine blue states and their districts and authorizers clamping down on new charter schools altogether, especially given the political left's antipathy to anything that blurs the line between church and state. So essentially you would have like a backlash in these other states saying like, no, we don't want anything to do with charters because they could just become religious schools and we don't want to see that proliferation. So I think that it could be a mixed, maybe even down party lines or down partisan lines from state to state of whether or not we'll see a proliferation of these or, if we'll see a flourishing after this. So it is kind of a big open question, even, and it could go the other way of saying, no, we're not. But I think that with recent precedent in the Supreme Court, I think maybe there's just kind of possibility that they could say that it is legal for religious charter schools to exist and that taxpayer funds could go to these. So, I mean, that's something that we're going to have to wait and see for the final answer. But it's going to be very interesting to see like how that shakes out down the road economically and into these different charter school systems through the states. So it could be, again, party lines of like we have blue states that are saying absolutely not, and then maybe red states are embracing this a lot more should the Supreme Court say that this is legal.
Well, Brennan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.